Well, go ahead and have a seat. Welcome to Village Church. If this is your first time here, my name is Steve. I'm one of the pastors here at Village Church, and as always, I'm thankful and grateful to see each and every one of you. If you have a Bible, go ahead and open it to Matthew 24. We're going to be starting this morning in verse 14, hopefully getting all the way through verse 28. But last week, we started taking a look at Matthew 24 as we continue our march through the entire book of Matthew. If you were not here last week, it may aid you to understand some of what I say today if you go back and listen to that sermon. But when we started looking at Matthew 24, we see that there's this emphasis on Jesus' prophecy against Jerusalem and the temple. And he prophesied the destruction of the temple that would take place in 70 AD. And he talked about this reality as he stood over the temple. And it's important to understand the context so that you will get it right, understanding that he's just left the temple as he's just engaged the religious rulers of that day. Now he's standing on the Mount of Olives, looking over Jerusalem, looking over the temple, speaking directly to his disciples about the future of Israel at that point. And he prophesied the destruction of the temple, and the disciples asked him, when will this happen? Jesus' answer is not so much focused on when, as we said last week. Jesus is focused on the what, the who, and the how of his prophecies. And even 2,000 years later, we still struggle to even get the questions that we have for Jesus right. Because most people, when you think about prophecy, you are mostly absorbed with the same question that the disciples were absorbed with. When are these things going to happen? So much so that many people get distracted from the present implications of the mission that Jesus would have you live in this world. And instead, you're just sitting there waiting for doomsday. But that's not the focus that Jesus wanted his disciples to have. And of course, then, it's not the focus that he wants you to have. The destruction that Jesus is talking about did take place in 70 AD as the Roman Emperor Titus Vespasian ordered the siege of Jerusalem, destroying the entire temple and killing over 1 million people and then burning it completely to the ground. And it all starts here with Jesus foretelling the destruction of the temple and the focus of the disciples being kind of redirected on the reaction that he wanted them to have in light of the coming judgment. And so when we go to verses 15 through 28, Jesus continues his prophecy of judgment as he focuses on the inner workings of the temple and even brings prophecy from the Old Testament, specifically from the prophet Daniel, into his monologue with the disciples. And the posture that Jesus takes will challenge some of you on what you may have been taught about Bible prophecy. But I simply want you to consider the context within which Jesus is speaking. And so we talk about things like the Abomination of Desolation, which I still maintain is probably the greatest name for a metal band that hasn't happened yet. And Jesus talks about these things. And many of you have probably been told that these are things yet to happen, when the reality is that Jesus was talking about things that were going to happen in that present generation when God poured his judgment on Jerusalem for the rejection of Jesus Christ. And so realize where we are, that a few days after this, the crucifixion takes place. And then 3 days later, the resurrection takes place. And Jesus is speaking to an audience of his countrymen of the judgment that God is going to lay on them for rejecting the one true God and the consequences that are coming to that very generation. We need to read this in light of the context of the book of Matthew, that it is contained in, with a focus on what the New Testament has in view of the emphasis that Scripture as a whole shows us about the redemptive plan of God and his judgment against sin. And so I want to start reading where we left off last week in verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. That's going to be important in just a few moments. Verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, don't go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Number one this morning, I want you to understand the divine authority of Jesus is the focus of the New Testament. The divine authority of Jesus is the focus of the New Testament. And so I want to kind of explain to you how to understand even kind of descriptive language that leaves you with questions because you're not sure what specifically it means. Understand everything from Matthew all the way through the book of Revelation is focused on establishing really one key theme for understanding the history of the entire world, specifically the history of all of redemptive history, even all the way back to Genesis, and that is the reality that Jesus is God. The New Testament focuses on establishing that fact along with the implication of that fact and the implication of his divinity being his ultimate authority and lordship over absolutely everything. And so when you consider the meaning of this section, it is vital to understand that it is all provoked by Jesus' words about the destruction of the temple. And so ultimately you can understand that Jesus' words here are in answer to the question of the disciples. When Jesus says, all of the temple will be thrown down, the disciples ask, when will these things happen? And Jesus is focusing on his lordship over the temple. And so Jesus is taking the position, I have ultimate authority over the temple. So number one, I have the authority to throw it down. Number two, here are the reasons I'm going to throw it down. And here's the reality of what's going to happen in the days when I'm going to throw it down. And so everything in this section needs to be understood in light of that reality. And so this destruction of the temple then is predicated also on the reality that in just a few days, Jesus will complete the mission of substituting his life for the lives of sinners in order to pay the penalty for sin. Then he's going to rise again, winning victory over sin and death. And this then eradicates the need for the sacrificial system of the Old Testament, thus ending temple sacrifice and opening the Holy of Holies and spreading the presence of God from being separated from men to being spread over the presence of the whole world through the proclamation of the gospel. And so if you go back all the way to the Exodus from Egypt, when they first build the tabernacle, the presence of God is bound into the Holy of Holies. Only the high priest can go in there once a year through a series of purification rituals to offer on the Day of Atonement the sacrifice for all of the sins of Israel. And that represents the separation of God from his people. And so in the New Testament, when Jesus comes, it is a fulfillment of the entire sacrificial system. The book of Hebrews tells us the blood of bulls and goats was never capable of actually forgiving anyone of their sins. That blood could not be effective as an atonement, but rather it was meant as a foreshadowing to the future coming of Jesus Christ, by which the blood of the Son of God would be sufficient because he was sinless and the authority over sin. Therefore, he could substitute himself, pay the penalty for sin, and Hebrews calls it the once for all sacrifice. And so as Jesus stands over the temple on the Mount of Olives on that day, teaching about the destruction, he realizes in just, you quiet down, lady, in just a few days, I didn't ask you anything, all right? I'll never understand why my watch does that. It must be my fat wrists. If you have an Apple, let the reader understand. If you have an Apple Watch, you know what I mean by that. But the reality is Jesus is saying all of these things with full knowledge that in a few days he's going to fulfill everything that was going on in the sacrifice. So to continue in perpetuity, to offer those sacrifices would actually be sacrilege. And so Jesus is standing there knowing his death and resurrection is going to eradicate all of these sacrifices, while the disciples have all of their hopes, all of their dreams, every vision for their future bound in that temple. Jesus understands this destruction needs to happen to spread you out of this place, because God isn't binding his presence in the Holy of Holies. Just as Habakkuk prophesied, as the waters cover the seas, so will the presence of God cover the entire world. And Jesus knows that this judgment must happen for that to take place. So, we must understand Jesus' statement in context, not just of Matthew 24, but of all of the chapters around it, the book that it is in, and the move outward from there, because that is how good Bible study is done. And so this prophecy is directly connected to everything that's been going on immediately from Matthew 21 all the way up to what Jesus is saying here. In Matthew 21, Jesus comes in the triumphal entry. The crowd cries out, "Hosanna, salvation belongs to our God." Then he immediately enters into Jerusalem, outside of the temple, curses the fig tree. It dies, representing the religious and spiritual life of Israel being counterfeit and lifeless. Then he goes into the temple, engages the religious leaders, gets into an argument with them. Then in Matthew 23, he pronounces 7 woes or statements of damnation onto the religious rulers of that day. Then he leaves the temple. And we talked last week how that represented the presence of God leaving the temple. Therefore, anything that was going to take place in there would now be counterfeit. Now he's standing over the temple as Lord of the temple, saying, this is what's going to happen to that. And so when you understand Bible prophecy, it is vital for you to focus on all of the scriptures around it, so that even kind of the allegorical language or the confusing terminology, while you may not understand it, you will at least understand the immediate context by which Jesus is talking about here. This all centers on the sin of Israel and their false religious practices in the temple. And so Jesus points then back. Look in verse 15. He points to the prophet Daniel. In Daniel 9:27, along with some texts in Daniel 11 and Daniel 12, Jesus prophesies from Daniel that there would be an abomination that would take place in the temple that would profane the name of God. Here's what the prophet Daniel said in Daniel 9:27. "And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator." One of the things that I love is all the different forms of desolate. Desolation, desolate, desolator. We're even going to see more later. Between the book of Malachi and Matthew, all right, so there's 400 years. If you look at the last book of the Old Testament, it's the prophet Malachi. Matthew is the first one that we have in order of the New Testament. Between these two events, these two books, there's a 400-year period called the intertestamental period. Between then, a group called the Seleucids came with the authority of Greece, the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. They invaded Jerusalem, and a man named Antiochus Epiphanes entered the temple, set up a monument to the false god Zeus, and further blasphemed by ordering the sacrifice of pigs in the temple to specifically defy God's instructions from the book of Leviticus. So if you understand, just very briefly, in Leviticus, pigs are treated as unclean animals. And so you do not sacrifice an unclean animal for the remission of sin. So when the Seleucids came in, they took down everything that would point to the Hebrew God, put up basically statues or maybe even just pictures of the false Greek god Zeus. I don't know if you know this or not. Zeus isn't real. False god. And so they put up his image, and then Antiochus Epiphanes wanted to rub in even further on the Jews his persecution. And so he committed blasphemy in the temple by ordering the slaughter and sacrifice of pigs. This is recorded in the historical book, if you want to look it up, if you're one of those. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 54 and 59 specifically talk about the fulfillment of this. Now, if you're a Jew in Jesus' day, you look to that and say that was the fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel. And so in verse 15, Jesus states, when he says, let the reader understand, which many point to Daniel's statement about the wise understanding the abomination of desolation in Daniel 12, 10 through 11. Daniel prophesied and said, many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly. And none of the wicked shall understand. And here's the key phrase, but those who are wise shall understand. And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now, Jesus is pointing to similar things happening. He doesn't discount the actions of Antiochus Epiphanes and all those soldiers, but instead says something in similar fashion will also take place at the destruction of the temple. And so we know that during the Roman sieges, it was normal for soldiers to take the Roman symbol of the eagle and set it up in whatever temple was being overwhelmed at that point. So anyone that Rome would conquer, they would set up their religion as a sign of their victory and knock down any religious practice that had previously started, so to claim that place for Roman authority. And so when Rome came into the temple of God before the destruction of Israel, they would have set up that eagle, and we know that they prevented, according to Josephus, any further sacrifices from the Jews to take place in the temple. And so we understand that Jesus is pointing to that key point. Therefore, we must understand that this was fulfilled, and the purpose is ultimately to show the authority of Jesus and the fact that Jesus knows what the future is and the power of his resurrection. And so that's the focus of the New Testament. Jesus is very much replacing the temple with himself and saying, just as in Habakkuk, when I told the Jews, I'm sending a wicked people in to overwhelm you as judgment, he's going to do the same thing through Rome. Rome was coming to lay siege to Jerusalem as the judgment of God. But understand, number 2 this morning, the judgment of Jesus should embolden Christians. The judgment of Jesus should embolden Christians. So many look at passages on judgment and are filled with fear. So many even Christians that believe that Jesus is God, believe that he holds the future, believe that he is the Redeemer, you still look at the future with great fear. Maybe some prophetic system had you really worried. I know we used to watch movies where they're bringing the guillotines back, all right? We're talking French Revolution days. They're bringing guillotines back to persecute Christians with. And you lay in bed awake at night, terrified and anxious about the future. Judgment passages in the scripture as a whole, specifically about your future, should fill you not with fear, but with hope and joy. They should embolden you about the future and even today's events, because you know that in the future, the judgment of God will be laid on people. And since you're a follower of Jesus Christ, Jesus has endured judgment for you. You have no judgment of your own to endure. Jesus has taken it. And so between verses 16 and 22, we see the scope of God's judgment. It reveals the scope that what is coming as a warning directly to his disciples. John Calvin wrote about this passage that the very survival of those disciples that were with Jesus on that day would depend on them being torn from the nation that they had been committed to through what they saw as a covenant of eternal salvation. And so the Jews, even the disciples with Jesus on that day, they looked at the temple, they looked at Jerusalem, and they fully believed that the future of their salvation was based on the survival of those two things. They said it's all about our city and it's all about our temple. That is where salvation is. Why? Because they had misunderstood the prophecies of God from the Old Testament. Jesus is there fulfilling all of the prophecies. All of salvation is bound up in him and his gospel. And they're still looking at this temple. And so God knows that for them to spread the gospel all over the world, what is he going to have to do? He's going to have to destroy it all. And through the destruction of Jerusalem, God's judgment works in spreading the Christian message, works in spreading the gospel all over the known world in that time. And in confirming the testimony of the prophet Daniel, Jesus is equipping the disciples with the knowledge to understand that salvation is not of Jerusalem ultimately. Salvation is of Jesus Christ. And so in verse 16, he extends the warning even beyond Jerusalem. Note, he says that you need to flee Judea. Well, Judea was the entire part of the land outside of Jerusalem and beyond. Jesus is seeking to spread his followers through this warning out of Jerusalem, out of Judea, into Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's from Acts 1:8. Where Jesus says, you need to go. You need to take the gospel to the entire known world. Luke records, as he records the Olivet Discourse, in chapter 21, verses 20 through 22, he adds that these are the days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. Note, he says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. And so what always fascinates me about the way that people look at Bible prophecy is they try to turn everything into some figurative thing for the future. You know, Russia's the bear, America's the eagle, all these different things. And then they will ignore the specificity of the language that Jesus uses. We know that between 66 and 70 A.D., Rome literally surrounded Jerusalem, so much so that there were years of famine where people literally starved to death. And Jesus is saying, this is what's going to happen in about 40 years after my resurrection. And it does. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are in the city depart. And let not those who are out of the country enter it. For these are the days of vengeance to do what? To fulfill all that is written. This is another nod to Old Testament prophecy. As the fulfillment in the New Testament by Jesus was phrased that it fulfilled all that was written. Even the Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 2, every promise of God finds its yes in Jesus. Luke posits that this is an act of judgment by God by using the term vengeance. Just as Israel was judged for faithlessness and idolatry in the Old Testament, so here they would be judged in 70 A.D. This language is reminiscent of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, aspects of Isaiah and Daniel, because Jesus is saying it's going to be the same level of judgment, but worse. Much of the language used here is reminiscent even of the language from Genesis 19:17, as Lot was warned to flee Sodom and Gomorrah as God would rain down judgment. Look at what he said. And as they brought them out, one said, escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. Much of the problems in most of your lives would be fixed if you would understand this key point. If you do not listen to the warnings of God, you will suffer under judgment. Much of life is that simple. People come to me and they say, it's not that simple. It's more complicated than that. They will present to me, they'll say, and this is what I'm doing with my life. These are the decisions I'm making with my life. This is how I'm acting in my life. And I will say, well, that doesn't take any faith. That's actually faithless and that's full of sin. So here's my answer to you. Listen to the warnings of God. Obey the commands of God. Follow Jesus with your life. And so often people will look at me and say, it's not that simple. And so I respond, you will continue to suffer. Because it is that simple. If God warns you about something, the correct response is to listen to his warning and act accordingly. History records that during the period of Acts, as persecution from the Jews on the church ramped up, Christians were forced to flee from Jerusalem. They were forced to flee from Judea. And then much later on, even the entire church of Jerusalem had to flee and join the dispersed church through modern-day Turkey, as Pastor James, not the one we've got, but the half-brother of Jesus, was killed for his faith right before Rome surrounded Jerusalem and refused to let anyone leave, thus saving the lives of the disciples. Jesus warned them. He made the environment happen to where they could listen to his warning. They were dispersed, even under unpleasant circumstances. They did not fall at the siege at Jerusalem. More importantly, though, do you know what happened in light of that? It spread the gospel over all of the Roman Empire. Friends, understand that when the church endures tribulation, it is not the judgment of God. Instead, it's tribulation from the evil one. It's tribulation from the enemy seeking to discourage us so that we will not endure in faith in Jesus. But God, being much smarter than Satan, always uses the worldly tribulation of the church to spread the gospel to places it's never been before. And that's exactly what happened in the first century. Through that tribulation, the gospel flourished all over the Roman Empire, and Jerusalem ultimately fell in judgment. And that teaches us a very key principle when you endure difficulty in your life. Trust God and carry on with his mission. No matter what you are facing in this world, always trust him and always live his mission. It reminds me of the admonition from the Sermon on the Mount and from Jesus in Matthew chapter 6. Starting in verse 33, he says, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things that you're concerned about, they'll be added unto you. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient is the day for its own trouble." I like the realism of Scripture. Jesus looks to his followers and he says, don't be worried about tomorrow. You got enough problems to deal with today. So focus on those. But note his overarching point. Your anxiety creates and cultivates an environment of worry and faithlessness in your life that will not fix the situation at all. Instead, focus on the warnings of God. Obey the commands of God, follow Jesus living his mission, and everything that you are concerned about, even if it doesn't work out the way that you want it to work out, leave it in God's hands. Focus your life on him. And I know so many of you struggle with the issue of anxiety. You are so worried about your future, your spouse's future, your children's future, your hermit crab's future. You're worried about every future thing in the world, gripped with anxiety. It's the number one issue in the church today, is the Christian struggle with anxiety. It is real. Do not deny it. It's happening in your life. But I will tell you, faith is the answer. Faith overcomes fear. Faith is the answer to worry. And again, I know the response. It's not that simple. It's not simple. It is difficult, but it's still the answer. Trust Jesus with everything in your life. Obey him, live his mission, and you will begin to build a conquering faith in your life. Will you cease to struggle? No, friends, I got a warning for you. You're still going to struggle. You're still going to be tempted into it. But Jesus clearly looks to us and says, do not worry about the future. Why? Because God's got it. You don't. Do you feel helpless about the future? Good. That's reality. But you can order your life in such a way that what you sow will be based on good reaping. What you reap will be based on good sowing. Leave the future to God. Because for the follower of Jesus, worst case scenario, you get killed. Guess what? You wake up in the kingdom of heaven, which is eternal pleasure forevermore. Christians, when they die, they raise again immediately. The world can't do anything for us. Unbelievers, just like in Jerusalem on 70 AD, when they fell under the wrath of God, when they died, they awoke to eternal damnation. Death upon death upon death upon death. And I know so many of you do not like focusing on that aspect of Scripture, but it's one of my favorite ones. We win. We will not lose. We can never lose. Why? Because the authority of Jesus Christ is eternal. So when the follower of Jesus reads passages about the judgment of God, you shouldn't be filled with fear. You should be trusting in His provision. He has no judgment left for you. Every ounce of judgment that existed for the sins of Steve Gentry was laid on Jesus Christ on Calvary. When Jesus gave His life, He fully paid the penalty for my sin. And when He rose from the dead, He won victory over sin and death for me. Therefore, I long to meet God, because when He sees me, He sees the very righteousness of His Son, Jesus Christ. Therefore, I have no fear of the future, because the worst that this world can throw at me does nothing but send me into the presence of God forever. And if you are a follower of Jesus, there is no judgment from God on you. When He looks to you, He sees the very righteousness and the very victory and the very triumph of His Son, Jesus Christ. Live in that, pleading for the world, flee to Jesus Christ. But when they don't, understand that even if they put you through tribulation, they will face the judgment of God for it, while you face eternity with God. So the follower of Jesus should read this and be emboldened about your faith. Is there tribulation in this world for Christians? Yes. We have over 2,000 years of church history to prove that that is true. But has anyone been successful in defeating the church? No. Because our King triumphs over all of them every single time. You kill us, we rise again into the kingdom. You persecute us, we win 10 more souls to our fight for the future of God's kingdom. Atheistic communism has been seeking to kill the message of the gospel in their countries for over 50 years, longer than that, since World War II. And that's just modern history. And what has the church done in all of those areas? Did you know that the largest group of Christians right now in the world is in communist China? Friends, the gospel will triumph even when the whole world stands against it. Therefore, never cower to the rulers of this world. I pray that that is the lesson you've taken from the last 2.5 years when they have tried to exert tyranny over even the Church of Jesus Christ. Never cower before them. They are not your true authority. We must obey God rather than men every single time, because our God reigns. Number 3 this morning, understand the triumph of Jesus establishes the future of Christians. The triumph of Jesus establishes the future of Christians. Verses 23 through 28, the best phrase that I can come up to explain them to you is live not by lies. Live not by lies. Do not look for salvation in places where Jesus is not. Our constant need for instant gratification and instant satisfaction and instant relief will lead you to look for answers in places where they are not. And that's what Jesus is talking about. Look in verse 23. He warns His followers. He says, if anyone looks to you and says, look, here is the Christ, or there He is, don't believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand, so if they say to you, look, He's in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, He's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Jesus looks to His people and He's saying, when the judgment hits, that's when the liars see their opportunities. And He says, people will rise up, even in the face of the resurrection of the Son of Man. They will rise up and say, He wasn't the Christ, I am the Christ. He didn't have the answers, I have the answers. They were going to rise up, and they did in Jerusalem, even in the face of Rome sieging them while they were suffering under famine, people starving to death. There were false prophets that rose up in the middle of Jerusalem and said, Jesus was wrong. We're going to be delivered from Rome. Understand that when Jesus gives you a pronouncement, it's final. Anyone that disagrees with Jesus is wrong and should not be followed. But many in Jerusalem believed them. Friends, many in our day believe them. Remember, even when I was a child, someone said, Jesus is in Waco, Texas. And the Branch Davidians were formed down there, a cult of another cult. It's weird how cults spring out of cults, spring out of cults, spring out of cults. And David Koresh said, I am the Christ. He was not the Christ. As Jerusalem fell, so did their compound. Friends, I need you to understand that Joseph Smith was a false Christ. The Watchtower from the Jehovah's Witnesses, that is a false Christ. Everyone that popped up, even in the first century, with what they proclaimed was a Gnostic gospel. Jesus wasn't a human being, he was a floating spirit. Therefore, deny physical suffering. That was not what Jesus said. These are all versions of false Christs. And the end of the story is that even those false Christs, guess what? They were slaughtered in 70 A.D. Even if they retreated to the inner rooms of the temple, saying, let us all run to the Holy of Holies, that is where we will be safe. Friends, the presence of God had departed. And all of it was torn down. Jesus was not there. He had risen and ascended into heaven. Verse 27 is an interesting text because it notes the coming of the Son of Man. And many look at that passage and they say, this couldn't have happened in 70 A.D. because that has not happened yet. And here and a little bit later, we're going to discuss that. But understand that in verse 27, it is not talking about the second coming of Jesus Christ. The second coming of Jesus Christ will happen. He's going to return. But in this passage, he's talking specifically about the fact that they would not be able to deny the judgment of the Son of Man at the fall of Jerusalem. Luke 17:24 through 30 speaks of the days of the Son of Man, then notes that he must suffer and be rejected by that specific generation. Starting in verse 24, it says, for as the lightning flashes and lights up the sky from one side to the other, so will the Son of Man be in his day. But first, he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. He's talking about the crucifixion. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating and drinking and marrying, being given in marriage, until the day when Noah entered his ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out of Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be when the Son of Man is revealed. Then it speaks of the coming of Jesus' coming in judgment. Again, specifically about 70 A.D. Moving forward, all of this would happen as a judgment from God. But note the warning for those that would be deceived. So convincing are the liars and the false teachers that they even seem to pull off signs and wonders. Commentator R.T. France notes that the memory of the miracles of Jesus should enable God's people to know the difference. But for those who do not have genuine faith, you will be duped by liars. The answers that they have may seem more immediate in offering satisfaction, but it is always counterfeit. Friends, I want you to understand that the more immediate the relief is offered, the more likely it's a lie. The more immediate the satisfaction offered, the more likely it is a lie. The gospel and the New Testament speak to us of endurance over a long period. Therefore, God's people should know the difference. Just like a weight loss pill that says 50 pounds in 1 week, friends, the false teachers will sell you a lot of goods that are always a lie. People have come. They've questioned the authority of the Bible. That's still happening today. People have attacked and persecuted the church. That is still happening today. People have offered false gospels and liberation through human means. That is still happening today. People have tried to neuter Jesus of his power and authority in order to continue in their sin. That is still happening today. Every one of them will lead you to hell, just like the false teachers did in 70 A.D. Friends, understand that the future belongs to disciple makers through the gospel. The future of Christianity is hopeful. The judgment of God on all who reject his salvation, understand, it is certain. And that is the point. This was the judgment of Israel. But understand, there is coming a judgment for the entire world. Verse 28 is interesting, and some people struggle to understand it. I think it's very simple. When it says the vultures always circle over the corpse, understand that it's talking about the liars, the false teachers. It's talking about those who would pervert Christianity to seek to lead away even from Jesus, his followers. They gather around death because that is their end. Not so for the Christian. When you flee to Jesus, you don't just sit and wait for destruction. You don't just sit and wait for it all to fall apart, for the world to be judged. You live for the purposes of God. The future belongs to the church of Jesus Christ. The gospel will triumph through his followers. Even when the same thing happening to Jerusalem will happen in the rest of this world. We have the promise that when we flee to Jesus, we have a life of mission, and realize that if they don't listen, just as Jerusalem fell, so will they. Therefore, sinner, if you are in here and you're not a follower of Jesus, friend, I want to warn you, trust in Jesus Christ or your end will be destruction. You will reap the wickedness that you are sowing, and you will reap it in eternal judgment from God. But the future belongs to Christianity. The future belongs to the church of Jesus Christ. The future belongs to those who obey him when he says, go, make disciples of all nations. Because Jesus is King. A few application points for you this morning. First, to understand Bible verses, you understand that verse and the section of verses that it's in, and the chapter that it's in, according to the book that it's in, according to the arc of the entire Bible. Just like you read all other literature. That's how you understand verses. So when people make prophecy super duper complicated, understand that they're not following those principles. Secondly, the entire New Testament is to be understood in light of the divine authority of Jesus. The entire New Testament is to be understood in light of the divine authority of Jesus. Thirdly, the judgment of God should embolden the Christian's faith and life. The judgment of God should embolden the Christian's faith and life. Are you afraid of the future? Are you trusting God for it? Are you afraid of judgment? Or do you realize it's been poured out on Jesus Christ for you? Then fourthly, God will judge the wicked. I don't want you to be mistaken about that. There is coming a day when just as Jerusalem fell, so will all the wicked all over the world. And fifthly, the future belongs to disciple makers. So what are you ordering your life around? Is it what God promises will bring the future of his kingdom? Or are you wasting your time on things that will fall?